The wind at Coronado Beach cuts like a blade in November, cold and salt-heavy, the kind of cold that gets into your bones and stays there. It was 0447 hours when the 43 recruits hit the sand for the fourth time that morning, and the Pacific Ocean was doing what the Pacific Ocean always does at that hour, promising nothing and threatening everything. She was already running, not jogging, running, chest forward, arms driving, boots hitting wet sand with the kind of mechanical precision that comes from 10,000 miles of log distance. The men around her were struggling. Some were sucking wind. One had already fallen behind. She was 3 positions ahead of where she'd started the set, moving through the darkness like she'd been born for it, which, in every way that mattered, she had been. Her name was Lieutenant Commander Elena Vasquez, 31 years old, 5 feet 6 inches, 142 pounds, and somewhere in a classified file that very few people had clearance to read, there was a number next to her name that made even hardened veterans go quiet when they heard it. 307 confirmed kills. The number wasn't a rumor. It wasn't an exaggeration born from the kind of locker room mythology that military culture runs on. It was real, documented, verified through after-action reports filed across 3 combat theaters over 11 years of deployment. It was a number that put her in a category occupied by fewer than a dozen human beings in the history of modern warfare, and every single one of those dozen had an entire story attached to them that the world had heard, studied, debated. Hayes, almost nobody knew. That was the point. Behind her, somewhere in the middle of the pack, a recruit named Marcus Webb was watching her run. Webb was 23 years old, 6 feet 2 inches, 220 pounds of Division I linebacker who had walked into BDOS 3 weeks ago with a kind of confidence that comes from never having been truly tested. He'd made it through hell week on raw physical strength and the specific brand of stubbornness that coaches call heart and drill instructors call a liability. He watched Vasquez run and something crossed his face that wasn't quite admiration. It was more complicated than that, more defensive. The kind of expression a man makes when something doesn't fit the story he's already written in his head about how the world works. She's going to flame out, he'd told his rackmate 3 days ago. They always do. Bodies aren't built the same. Physics doesn't care about politics. His rackmate, a quiet kid from Montana named Torres who'd done 2 years in the 75th Ranger Regiment before applying for SEAL selection, had looked at him for a long moment without saying anything. Then he'd gone back to maintaining his kit. Torres knew something Webb didn't. Torres had done his research. Behind the recruit formation, standing on a rise of packed sand above the waterline, Senior Chief Petty Officer Dale Reeves watched the column move. Reeves had been at BUDOS for 6 years. He'd seen 900 recruits come through, watched maybe 140 make it, and in that time he'd developed a calibrated eye for the ones who would and the ones who wouldn't. It wasn't about size. It wasn't about strength. The ones who made it shared something that was almost impossible to describe but instantly recognizable once you'd seen it enough times. He watched Vasquez move through the darkness and a small sound came out of him that might have been satisfaction. She had it. She'd always had it. He'd known that since the moment she walked into his compound 14 months ago with transfer orders from Naval Special Warfare Command and a service record that had made him sit down and read it twice. She was here as an observer, officially, an instructor-track evaluation embedded in the training cycle to assess integration protocols for the Navy's new gender-neutral Special Operations Framework. That was the official story. The real story was something else. The real story started 31 years ago in a small town in New Mexico called Magdalena, where the Chupadera Mesa rises out of high desert country and the wind comes down off the mountains carrying the smell of juniper in distance. Elena Vasquez grew up in a house where the walls were thin, the winters were long, and her father, a former Army Ranger named Hector Vasquez, taught her 2 things with complete consistency from the time she was old enough to listen. First, the world will tell you what you can't do. Your only job is to ignore it and do the thing anyway. Second, precision matters. In everything. Every time. Without exception. Hector Vasquez had been a sniper instructor at Fort Benning for 8 years before a training accident took most of the hearing in his left ear and sent him home to Magdalena to run a hardware store and raise his daughter alone. He still had his rifles. He still had his logbooks, those dense composition notebooks filled with his cramped handwriting recording every shot, every condition, every calculation across 20 years of shooting. He still had the patience that special operations work either builds or destroys, and he had poured every ounce of it into Elena. She fired her first rifle at age 7. A .22 LR, bolt action, prone position, 25 meters. Her father behind her, not touching, not correcting, just watching. She hit the center of the target on the third shot. Her father said nothing. He made a note in his logbook. By the time she was 12, she was shooting .308 at 400 meters with a consistency that made her father's old shooting partners go silent at the range. Not the impressive silence of watching a prodigy, the serious silence of men who recognized something genuine. By the time she was 16, she was competing in national-level precision rifle matches and finishing in the top 10 against competitors who outweighed her by 60 pounds and had been shooting competitively since before she was born. She didn't do it with flash. She didn't do it with drama. She did it the way her father had taught her, with the particular internal stillness that separates good shooters from great ones. That place between heartbeats where everything goes quiet and the world contracts to a single point of focus. She enlisted in the Navy at 18 because the Navy had a program that interested her. Specifically, the Navy had a program that would eventually, if she was good enough and patient enough and willing to outlast every system that would try to push her sideways, put her in the vicinity of the most demanding special operations environment on the planet. She was patient. She was good enough. And she was built from a particular kind of stubbornness that doesn't announce itself and doesn't argue with you. It just keeps showing up every morning until the argument becomes irrelevant. 8 years in, she was a Naval Special Warfare Combat Support Operator attached to SEAL Team 6 Intelligence Support Activity. She wasn't a SEAL. She was something the SEALs used when they needed eyes somewhere they couldn't put a team, a voice in an overwatch position that could reach out to half a mile and speak with absolute authority. She was what operators called a guardian angel, the person between the assault element and everything that wanted to kill them. She was the best one they had. The classified file with the number 307 next to her name had been accumulating entries since her first deployment to Afghanistan in 2014, when she was 20 years old and the temperature in Nangarhar province in August sits around 4 to 5 degrees Celsius and the terrain is a geologist's dream and a soldier's nightmare, all crumbling ridgelines and blind draws and sight lines that reward patience and punish haste. Her first confirmed kill was at 840 meters. The target was an IED in place of setting up a device on a supply route that coalition forces had used 3 times in the past week. She was in a hide she'd built herself over 48 hours, a pile of rocks and thermal-resistant material that looked like every other pile of rocks on the hillside. She was alone except for a radio and a logbook that looked exactly like her father's. She lay in that hide for 19 hours before she fired a single shot. When she did fire, the emplacer fell. The road stayed clear, and a convoy of 14 vehicles passed through the next morning without incident. She made a note in her logbook. That was how it began. Patient, precise, unannounced, adding entries to a document that would eventually become one of the most remarkable service records in the history of naval special warfare. Not because she sought the record. Records were a side effect. She sought the outcome, the team that came home, the road that stayed clear, the mission that succeeded because someone with the right skills had been in the right position and had done the job without flinching. 11 years. 3 theaters. Iraq, Syria, Somalia. Short deployments to places that didn't officially exist, attached to operations that didn't officially happen, doing work that would never be described in a press release or acknowledged in a ceremony. 307 entries in her logbook. None of them made in haste. None of them made in error. The sun was beginning to suggest itself on the eastern horizon when the recruit formation finished its run and assembled on the beach for the next evolution. The instructors moved through them like water finding cracks, looking for the ones who were protecting something, favoring an injury, going somewhere internal that meant they were thinking about quitting. The Pacific lay flat and gray beyond the surf zone, the kind of calm that doesn't last. Elena stood in the formation, breathing controlled, heart rate coming down. The cold didn't register on her face the way it registered on the faces around her. 11 years in hard places had recalibrated her relationship with discomfort to the point where cold was simply information, not suffering. Webb was 2 rows behind her. She could feel his eyes without turning around. She'd been feeling eyes like his her entire career, that particular quality of attention that was half curiosity and half denial. The gaze of someone trying to find the evidence that would confirm what he already believed. Senior Chief Reeves stepped to the front of the formation, and his voice carried over the sound of the surf without effort. Reeves had one of those voices that didn't get loud so much as it got heavy, like the air pressure change when he was serious. "Good morning," he said, and there was nothing warm about it. "Who ya?" 43 voices answered. 43, Reeves said. "That's what started this morning. Let me tell you something about that number. By the time we're done with today, it's going to be smaller. It always gets smaller. Not because I decide it, because you decide it. Every time someone reaches back for the bell and rings it, that's not failure. That's information. That's the moment when the person finds out who they actually are instead of who they thought they were." He paused. The surf filled the silence. "There's one person standing in this formation today who already knows who she is," Reeves said, and he said it without looking at Elena, without any signal of attribution. "She's been knowing for a while. The rest of you are still finding out. That's fine. That's what we're here for. Now, boats overhead. Let's go." The boats came down. The evolution began. And somewhere in the formation, Marcus Webb heard the pronoun and felt something tighten in his chest that he didn't want to examine too closely. The boat crew evolution was exactly as miserable as advertised. Inflatable boats, 300 pounds of rubber and equipment, balanced on heads that were already salt-crusted and exhausted from 4 hours of cold water immersion. The beach runs with boats overhead were not about strength. They were about the specific kind of collective suffering that forges units, that creates the shared language of hard things endured together. You learn more about a person in 6 hours of boat cruise than you learned in 6 months of working beside them in an office. Elena's boat crew was 7 people. Torres, a rangy former Marine raider named Castellano who had the most efficient movement pattern Reeves had ever logged in a BUDOS class. 2 reservists from the East Coast who were better than they looked. A kid from Hawaii named Karmika who was built like a tank and smiled through suffering with the specific cheerfulness of someone who has decided, at a fundamental level, that nothing is going to break him. And Webb. Webb had ended up in Elena's boat crew through the random assignment of alphabetical ordering, and he was currently carrying his portion of 300 pounds and trying to figure out how to be resentful of someone who was carrying the same weight with the same competence and not giving him anything to be resentful about. It was irritating in a specific way he couldn't articulate. "Dig in," Elena said, and her voice was quiet. Not commanding, just factual. "Lean forward. Weight distribution. Stop fighting it and carry it." She wasn't talking to him specifically. She was talking to the boat crew. But Webb felt it anyway. "I've been carrying things a while," he said, and there was an edge in it. "I can tell," she said, and she said it without any edge at all, which was somehow worse. Torres glanced sideways at Webb with an expression that communicated something clearly, something that Webb translated as warning but didn't understand the reason for yet. Not fully. The reason would become clear in time, the way most important things become clear. Gradually, then all at once, and usually at the worst possible moment. The evolution continued. The sun climbed. The Pacific stopped being gray and started being cold blue, the color of shallow water over pale sand. And the instructors moved through the formations with a relentless focus of people who had decided long ago that compassion was not the same thing as cruelty. They were not cruel. They were unrelenting. The difference mattered. By 1100 hours, 3 recruits had rung the bell. The formation was 40. By 1400, it was 38. The attrition was happening the way it always happened, not in dramatic collapse but in the quiet accumulation of decision. The moment when the internal accounting finally came out negative and the person understood that they were done, not because their body was done, but because the part of them that was making the choice had made a different one. Elena didn't watch the departures. She'd learned years ago that watching people quit was bad for the part of your brain you needed for everything else. She kept her focus on the task, the immediate task, the next evolution, the next meter, the next breath. Webb watched the departures. He couldn't help it. Each departure made him feel something complicated, something that was part relief and part guilt. The relief of someone who is glad it wasn't them, and the guilt of knowing the relief is there. "You think she's going to ring it?" one of the other recruits asked him during a brief water break, nodding in Elena's direction. Webb looked at her. She was sitting on the sand with her eyes closed, not sleeping, just conserving. Her breathing was controlled and even. There was a quality of stillness about her that he had noticed before and couldn't quite categorize. She didn't look tired the way the rest of them looked tired. She looked like someone who had relocated her relationship with tired to somewhere it couldn't reach her. "I don't know," Webb said, and it was the most honest thing he'd said in 3 weeks. The afternoon brought the pool competency evolutions, which were exactly as brutal as the beach had been, and then the lob PT as the sun went down. And by the time the evening meal was done and the recruits were in their racks, 27 of the original 43 were still in the program, and everyone who remained had a certain quality in their eyes that the ones who'd rung the bell didn't have. Not superiority. Something more interior than that. Something that had been tested and hadn't broken. Webb lay in his rack and stayed at the ceiling and listened to the sound of 37 other people breathing and thought about the boat crew evolution. He thought about Elena's voice. Quiet. Factual. Not asking for acknowledgement or performing competence. Just doing the thing and saying what needed to be said. He thought about what Torres hadn't said to him when he'd made his comment about physics 3 days ago. Torres, who had been in the 75th Rangers, who had done 2 rotations to Afghanistan and 1 to Syria, who had the specific economy of movement and evaluation that combat experience leaves on a person like a watermark. Torres wasn't someone who withheld information without a reason. Webb made a note to ask. In the morning, when they were past the next evolution and into the brief window of recovery that BUD-OS allowed, which wasn't much, but it was something, he didn't sleep right away. He lay there in the dark and thought about the number of things he'd assumed without examining them, and about how assumptions had a way of coming due. The next morning came the way all mornings came at Coronado, early and cold and completely indifferent to how anyone felt about it. The surf zone was running higher, a weather system somewhere out in the Pacific pushing 4-foot sets against the shore, and the instructors had that particular alertness they got when conditions moved from merely brutal to genuinely dangerous. The fine line between the two was something they managed with calibrated judgment, but they managed it seriously. The steel pier evolution. Everyone in the water, everyone in the cold. And the temperature of the Pacific in November at Coronado is 54 degrees Fahrenheit, cold enough that the body's first response is to fight it, to try to generate heat through movement. And the second response, if you're trained and disciplined, is to stop fighting and let the cold become information rather than enemy. Elena was third into the water. She went in without hesitation, without the sharp gasp that most people can't suppress at first contact with 54-degree water, and she stayed at the surface with her breathing controlled and her movement efficient and her eyes open. Beside her, Karmika surfaced with a grin that seemed biologically implausible given the temperature. "Good morning," he said, through chattering teeth, still grinning. "Good morning," she answered. "My Ohana would say this is what the ocean does when it loves you," he said. "Your Ohana is optimistic. We're from Maui. Optimism is genetic." She almost smiled. Almost. The cold didn't allow for much facial movement, but something crossed her face that Karmika registered and filed away with satisfaction. In the 3 weeks of the training cycle, he'd been making a project of that almost smile, cataloging the conditions under which it appeared. He decided she was worth knowing, not because of what he'd heard about her, which was nothing concrete, but because of how she moved under pressure, which was like someone who had made a private agreement with hard things that the hard things had agreed to honor. Webb entered the water nearby, and the cold hit him, and he didn't suppress the gasp, because the gasp is human and BUD-OS doesn't punish the gasp. But OS punishes the quitting, not the pain. He oriented himself and began the evolution, and beside him, without comment or drama, Elena Vasquez was already doing the thing that needed doing next. It was during the 5th evolution of the morning that things shifted. The evolution was a timed underwater navigation swim. Compass bearings, no surface reference, measured distances, precise turns. The kind of task that rewards the people who can be precise under conditions of significant physical and cognitive stress, When the body is cold and tired and the lungs are tight and the mind wants to simplify everything down to the single question of survival. Webb's compass bearing was off on the second leg. Not by much. 3 degrees of drift. But 3 degrees over the length of the leg put him 6 meters off his target. And when he surfaced, he was out of position and had to swim back to the marker with the instructor's stopwatch running and the performance documented. He surfaced, oriented, assessed, began the correction. Beside him in the water, Elena surfaced within 18 inches of her target marker, touched it, looked at her compass, looked at the instructor, and waited. The instructor, a veteran named Petty Officer Second Class Rodriguez, who had been running aquatic evolutions for 4 years and had the underwater vision of someone who'd spent more of his life subsurface than not, looked at her position and made a note on his waterproof clipboard. "On target," he said. The flatness in his voice was the highest available form of praise in this environment. Elena treaded water and didn't react to the words. She was already thinking about the next leg. Webb, returning to position, watched her touch the marker and heard Rodriguez's 2 words and felt something move inside him. Not resentment, exactly. More like the first small crack in a wall that he had built, over years, from assumptions he'd never questioned because questioning them had never seemed necessary. The crack was small, but it was there. He filed it away the way Torres had filed the almost smile, because some information needs to accumulate before it changes anything. 3 more bells rang before lunch. 24 recruits remaining. The formation looked smaller now, tighter, the way formations look when the people who remain have begun to trust each other with something significant. The trust wasn't spoken. It didn't need to be. It was built from shared suffering, from the specific intimacy of being cold and exhausted beside someone and watching them stay anyway. The lunch break was 20 minutes. In 20 minutes you could eat, treat any developing injuries, change wet gear if you were lucky, and prepare yourself mentally for the afternoon. The smart recruits ate fast and did the preparation. The ones who lingered over the pain assessment were usually the ones who rang the bell before dinner. Webb sat beside Torres with a meal he was consuming with the focused efficiency of someone refueling a machine, and after 2 minutes of silence he said, "You were going to tell me something." 3 days ago. Torres looked at him, continued eating. "About Vasquez," Webb said. Torres put down his fork. He looked at the middle distance for a moment, the way people look when they're deciding how much to say. Then he said, "You know what a confirmed kill is?" "Obviously." "You know what the record is for a confirmed sniper kill count in the U.S. military?" Webb knew the names. Everyone who'd been through SEER training and studied special operations history knew the names. Chuck Mawinney, Carlos Hathcock. The modern era records, classified or otherwise. He said the range of numbers. Torres nodded. "Her file has a number in it," he said. "I heard it from a guy who was in ISA. He said it like he was reporting damage to the roof. Like it was just a fact. The way you say the temperature." Webb looked at Torres. "What was the number?" Torres told him. Webb's fork stopped moving. He set it down. He looked across the galley to where Elena was sitting with Carmichael and Castellano, eating with the same focused efficiency, not talking much, listening to Carmichael tell a story about something that had happened in the water that morning. Something that was apparently funny because Castellano's shoulders were shaking, and Elena's face had the quality of the almost smile that Carmichael had been cataloging for 3 weeks. 307. Webb sat with the number for a long moment. He thought about the comment he'd made 3 days ago. About physics. About bodies. He thought about a woman who had been to Afghanistan and Iraq and Syria and other places that didn't have official names, who had been in hide she built with her own hands for 48 hours at a stretch, who had looked through a scope at ranges beyond what most people understood as possible and made decisions that operational commanders had trusted and that outcomes had validated, over and over and over, 307 times. He thought about the cold voice in the boat crew evolution. Lean forward. Weight distribution. Stop fighting it and carry it. He thought about his own voice 3 days ago. Bodies aren't built the same. Physics doesn't care about politics. Something moved in his chest that was larger than the crack from the morning. Something structural. Torres was watching him with the expression of someone who had expected this and was not without sympathy. "Why didn't you say something?" Webb said. It wasn't an accusation. It was a genuine question. Didn't seem like the kind of thing that changes a person if you just tell them, Torres said. Seemed like the kind of thing they need to figure out at the right speed. Webb nodded slowly. He picked up his fork. He finished his meal in silence and then sat for the remaining 4 minutes of the break thinking about speed. About the rate at which a person's understanding can change. About whether it was possible to change fast enough to matter. The afternoon evolved into evening and evening into another night and another morning. And the training cycle continued with a relentless forward momentum that is BUDOS's most basic characteristic. It does not pause for reflection. It does not accommodate the internal timeline of personal growth. It just keeps presenting the next evolution, the next test, the next moment where you find out again who you are. Webb kept finding out. So did the others. By the end of the second week, 18 recruits were still in the program, and the ones who remained had a particular quality of shared understanding that was different from what they'd arrived with. Something had been burned away. The performance of toughness had been replaced by actual toughness, which is quieter and less photogenic and more reliable. Elena was in the 18. She had been in all the water. She had completed all the evolutions. She had done it without announcement, without drama, without asking anyone to notice, which is the most reliable way to get noticed by the people whose notice matters. Senior Chief Reeves noticed. He had been noticing for 2 weeks, documenting what he observed with the same rigor that Elena applied to her logbook. Not because he doubted she could do this. He'd seen her service record and he knew she could, but because he needed to understand how she did it. The mechanism, the specific integration of physical capacity and mental architecture that produced someone like this, because understanding it was how you taught it to others. He watched her during the night navigation evolution in the 3rd week, when they were in the hills east of the beach, when the temperature had dropped to 38 degrees and the terrain was the kind that takes ankles if you let it. She moved through the dark with a specific quietness that wasn't just technique. It was something older than technique. It was orientation, the unconscious spatial awareness that long years in hard terrain builds in certain people, the ability to read ground by the way it feels underfoot, to navigate by elevation change and wind direction and the sound that air makes when it moves around obstacles. She was back at the rally point 11 minutes before the next closest recruit. She sat down against a rock and opened her water bottle and waited. And Reeves, watching from 120 meters away through a night optic, thought about a conversation he'd had 6 months ago with a Naval Special Warfare Command analyst who had pulled Elena's file and said, without dramatic inflection, that what they were looking at was a once-in-a-generation thing. The kind of thing that comes along rarely enough that most institutions miss it because the institution wasn't designed to accommodate it. Reeves was not going to miss it. The next morning he called her into his office, which was a small room that smelled like coffee and gun oil and the accumulated authority of a man who had been serious about his work for 22 years. She stood at ease in front of his desk. She was wearing her working uniform, and her face had the quality of someone who had slept 4 hours and was functioning at full capacity anyway, because 4 hours was what was available and she had long ago stopped requiring more than what was available. "How are you doing?" he said. "Fine, Senior Chief." "That's not what I asked." A pause. She recalibrated. "I'm managing the sleep deficit. The cold water is harder than it used to be, which tells me I'm not 23 anymore. The land navigation is comfortable. The team dynamics are developing." "Webb," he said. She looked at him steadily. "Webb is figuring something out. You know what he said about you?" "I know the category of thing he said. I've been hearing that category of thing for 11 years. It doesn't require a specific response." "What does it require?" "Continuing to do the work," she said simply. Reeves looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "You're not here just for the observer track." She said nothing, which was itself a kind of answer. "Command wants to know if it can be done," he said. "If the pathway is viable. Full integration. Not the support role. The role." He paused. "They sent the right person to answer the question." "I know. Webb's going to figure out what Torres already knows. When he does, he's going to have a harder time with it than Torres did, because he's got more to undo. Most people do." Reeves leaned back. "What do you need from me?" She thought about it for a moment, genuinely. Not performing consideration, actually considering. "Don't shield me from anything," she said. Same standard. Same evaluation. If I can't do it on the same standard, the answer to the question is no, and Command should know that honestly. That's what I thought you'd say. He picked up his coffee cup. Dismissed. She left without looking back, and Reeves sat for a moment with his coffee and the sound of the ocean coming through the single window and the particular satisfaction of a man who has spent 22 years looking for the exceptional and has found it again. The fourth week was the week that broke things open. Not in the program. In the understanding. The exercise was a simulated hostage rescue scenario, the kind of composite evaluation that BUD/OS uses in its later phases to test integration under conditions closer to actual operational demand. Multiple elements. Moving targets. Incomplete information. Time pressure. The kind of scenario where technical skill is necessary but not sufficient, where judgment matters as much as capability, where the decisions made in the first 30 seconds shape everything that follows. The recruits were divided into assault and overwatch elements. The assignments were made by the instructors based on demonstrated aptitude, which meant Elena was placed in the overwatch position, which was where the people with the best long-range precision and situational awareness always went. Webb was in the assault element. He was good in the assault element. His size, his strength, his reflexes were genuine assets in close-quarters work, and the weeks of BUD/OS had sharpened them further, stripped away everything soft and left what was real. He moved through the simulated building with the controlled aggression of someone who had found their correct application. The scenario began at 0200 hours. The objective was a simulated compound, 3 structures, 6 notional hostages, unknown number of opposing forces using simulated weapons. Elena was in a height 280 meters from the primary structure, cold ground, prone, eye to the scope of a .308 precision rifle loaded with marking rounds, her radio live and her logbook open. She had been in the hide for 2 hours before the assault element moved. In those 2 hours, she had mapped the compound completely. Movement patterns, personnel count, timing of guard rotations, structural vulnerabilities, sight lines into and out of each building. The kind of patient systematic observation that most people can do for 20 minutes before their attention starts to degrade. Elena could do it for 20 hours. At 0147, she keyed her radio. Control, Overwatch. I have a count of 9 opposing. 2 on the north structure roof. 1 mobile patrol on the east side, 16-minute rotation. 3 inside the primary structure, positions approximate. 1 on the secondary entry, 1 mobile internal. 1 unknown, intermittent appearance at the western window, inconsistent pattern. The instructor monitoring her transmission, a warrant officer named Bryce who had done 4 SEAL deployments and currently ran the composite evaluation program, made a note. The count was correct. All 9 positions identified, documented, and correctly characterized. Time on target, 112 minutes of observation. Standard requirement for this evaluation, 4 positions identified at minimum. She had given them all 9. Bryce made his note without expression, but the note said, in the margin, underlined, field ready. The assault began. Webb's element entered on the east side, following Elena's information about the guard rotation, timing the entry to the 60-minute gap she had identified. They moved fast and quiet, and the gap was exactly where she said it would be, and the first 2 structures cleared without incident. The third structure was where the scenario complicated. One of the simulated opposing forces had moved from their log position. Unexpected variable. The instructor had introduced it deliberately, not in the briefing, as a test of how the team adapted to change conditions. The figure appeared in a window on the west side of the primary structure, and if Webb's element had continued on their original approach vector, they would have walked into its engagement zone without warning. Elena saw the movement. She was already watching that window, the unknown, inconsistent appearance she'd noted at 0147. She keyed the radio immediately. Overwatch to assault. Halt. West window. Figure armed. Unknown disposition. Halt. Webb's element stopped. 1 second of hesitation. 2. The kind of seconds that, in real operations, are the difference between a solved problem and a catastrophic one. The figure in the window moved. Elena tracked it, watched, processed. Contact assessed as separated from primary group. Possible injured or disoriented. Suggest approach from northeast corner. Window will be obscured by structure angle at 40 meters. Go. They went. The approach worked. The structure cleared. The scenario completed successfully. Time, 4 to 7 minutes. Standard completion benchmark, 60 minutes. The debrief happened at dawn, in a small conference room with bad lighting and good coffee and the particular atmosphere of a space where performance gets examined without sentiment. Bryce ran it. He was methodical and specific, going through each element, each decision, each outcome. When he got to Elena's position, he read her transmission log from a night. Not summarized, verbatim, all 9 positions. The timing, the characterization of each, the movement warning. Silence. Webb was sitting at the far end of the table. He was listening to the transmission log being read back, and he was thinking about the scenario from inside his position, where he had had partial information and had been moving through the dark, and thinking about what the world had looked like from where he was. And then he was thinking about what the world must have looked like from 280 meters away, in the cold and the dark, for 2 hours, in a hide, with a scope and a radio and that particular internal stillness. He thought about 307. He thought about 11 years. He thought about a voice in a boat crew evolution. Lean forward. Weight distribution. Stop fighting it and carry it. Bryce finished reading the log and put it down and looked around the table. Overwatch performance, he said, was exceptional. Not relative to the standard. Not exceptional for this phase of training. Exceptional in any context I've evaluated in 12 years of running these assessments. That's the number, and that's my evaluation. He moved to the next element of the debrief. He was a professional. He didn't dwell or dramatize. The assessment was made and recorded, and it would go into a file that would reach people at Naval Special Warfare Command who were waiting for exactly this kind of data. But the silence in the room after he said it was not nothing. It was the silence of 18 people recalibrating. Webb, at the end of the table, said nothing. But something in his posture had changed. The specific quality of his silence was different from what it had been 3 weeks ago. Something had been completed in him. Some internal accounting had finally come out clean. After the debrief, in the corridor outside, he found Torres. "I owe her an apology," Webb said. "Yeah. Is it stupid to apologize for something she doesn't know I said?" Torres thought about this seriously, the way he thought about most things. "I don't think she doesn't know you said it," he said. "I think she decided it wasn't worth correcting." "That's different." Webb stood with that for a moment. "What do I say?" "The truth," Torres said. "Whatever the truth actually is." The truth, Webb had been arriving at slowly and then all at once, was something he was still finding the language for. It had something to do with the specific shape of his mistake, which wasn't a mistake of malice but a mistake of assumption. The ordinary human failure of constructing a world in your head and then being surprised when the actual world declines to match it. He'd looked at a person and seen a category. He'd heard a voice and processed it through a framework built from every unexamined thing he'd absorbed about who belonged in this world and who didn't. The person had not been the category. The voice had not fit the framework. The facts, as documented in a classified file and demonstrated in a training evolution at 200 hours in the cold November dark, had declined to care about the framework. He found her that afternoon during the maintenance period, when the recruits were going over equipment with the kind of focused attention that good operators develop for the tools that keep them alive. She was at a workbench with her rifle broken down into its components, running a ball brush through the barrel with the automatic competence of someone who had done this 10,000 times. Her logbook was open beside her, and she was making a small notation in it, the kind of shorthand entry that meant something to the person writing it and nothing to anyone else. He sat down at the other end of the workbench. He didn't say anything immediately. He picked up his own rifle and began his own maintenance, because some conversations happen better when hands are occupied. After 2 minutes of the mechanical sounds of cleaning and maintenance, he said, "I made a comment 3 weeks ago to Torres." She continued cleaning the barrel. Did not look up. "I said bodies aren't built the same. I said physics doesn't care about politics." He paused. "I was wrong." She set down the ball brush. She picked up a clean cloth and ran it through the barrel. She held the receiver up to the light and looked through the ball. She was checking the cleaning, doing her job, and she said, without drama or resentment, "I know. I'm sorry." She set the barrel down. She looked at him for the first time in the conversation with a direct, calibrated attention that she brought to anything she was actually assessing. Not hostile, not warm, honest. "What changed your mind?" she asked. He thought about the transmission lock, about 9 positions in the dark at 280 meters, about a voice in a boat crew, about a number he'd heard from Torres over a fast lunch. He said the honest thing. Evidence. Something moved in her face. Not quite the almost smile. Something more significant than that. Something that acknowledged, without sentimentality, that a person had done the work of changing. "That's all it ever takes," she said. She went back to her rifle. He went back to his. The maintenance room was quiet except for the sounds of professionals maintaining the tools of their trade, and outside the single small window the Pacific was doing what it always did, promising nothing, threatening everything, indifferent and eternal, and somehow exactly right. 3 days after the maintenance room conversation, the training cycle entered its final composite phase, and the Pacific stopped being metaphorical about its intentions. The storm came in from the northwest on a Tuesday, the kind of weather system that the Coronado instructors watched on satellite feeds with professional interest, and the recruits watched through barracks windows with the specific dread of people who understood that weather was not an excuse, it was a condition. Low pressure, sustained winds at 23 knots, wave sets in the surf zone running 6 to 8 feet, water temperature dropping 2 degrees to 52. The kind of conditions that made everything harder and faster and less forgiving. Senior Chief Reeves briefed the morning evolution in the pre-dawn dark with his usual economy of language. "The weather does not reschedule," he said. "Neither do we." 16 recruits remaining. 2 more had rung the bell in the past 72 hours. Quiet departures. No drama. Just the bell in the chair and the walk away from the formation and the particular silence the formation held after someone left. 16 recruits, moving through the final evaluation phase, and every one of them had by now the look of people who had been stripped down to something essential and were operating from that place. Elena ran her pre-dawn checks with a focused routine she'd built over 11 years of deployments that began in darkness. Rifle condition. Uptick zeroed. Radio battery at full charge. Logbook in the left cargo pocket. Waterproof cover. Same as always. She moved through the checklist the way her father had taught her. Not fast, not slow, with the particular attention that treats each check as if it matters. Because it does. Because the difference between a functioning system and a non-functioning system is exactly the margin between coming home and not. Outside, the wind was picking up. She could hear it in the eaves of the barracks building, a sound that was almost vocal, the kind of sound that makes you understand why cultures used to believe weather was animate. It wasn't, but it was honest. Wind at 23 knots does not pretend to be comfortable. It is what it is, and it will do what it will do, and the only productive response is to work with it, because working against it is a consumption of energy that produces nothing. She thought about her father. She did this sometimes before difficult things began, not out of sentimentality, but because Hector Vasquez had been in difficult things many times and had developed good thinking about them, and some of that thinking lived in her now as a kind of baseline orientation. He had said once, during a winter morning on the shooting range when she was 14 and the wind was doing something similar to what it was doing now, and she was frustrated with her groups because the wind kept moving her point of impact, he had said, "The wind is not your enemy. The wind is a variable. Variables can be calculated. Work the variable." She had worked the variable. Her groups had tightened. The wind had continued doing what it was doing, indifferent to her groups, indifferent to everything. And she had worked inside that indifference and found the performance anyway. Work the variable. She stepped outside into the dark and the wind and began moving toward the assembly point. The final composite evaluation was not advertised in advance. That was deliberate. Operational scenarios don't come with advance notice. The recruits knew a major evaluation was imminent. They didn't know the form it would take, the terrain, the specific challenges. They showed up at the assembly point and they listened and they adapted, because adaptation is the core competency that everything else supports. Reeves stood at the front of the 16 with Warrant Officer Bryce and two other instructors whose names the recruits had learned and whose assessments they'd learned to take seriously. The briefing was precise and limited, as briefings in this environment always were. Multiple elements scenario. Live terrain, controlled area, opposing forces simulated. You will receive fragmentary information and you will make decisions from it. The evaluation is not just on what you do. It is on how you think. Execution begins in 20 minutes. Draw your equipment. The scenario was this: a notional communications relay station in the hills east of the base, a position of significant simulated strategic value, had been infiltrated by a simulated opposing force. The relay station controlled communications for a notional forward operating base. If it remained in opposing hands for more than 90 minutes, the simulated FOB went dark. A rescue and re-establishment operation was required. 6 kilometers of mixed terrain between the assembly point and the objective. Storm conditions. Night. Incomplete intelligence on opposing force disposition. 90-minute window. Elena was assigned Overwatch again. The assignment was not a reduction. In this scenario, the Overwatch position was the most tactically critical element. The terrain between the assembly point and the objective had 3 natural choke points where an opposing force could interdict the assault element if they got there first. Clearing those choke points with precision fires from a distance was the difference between the assault element arriving intact and the assault element not arriving at all. She looked at the terrain map for 4 minutes. She memoized the elevation changes, the vegetation density at each choke point, the likely positions a thinking opposing force would use for interdiction. She calculated her movement timeline to get to a position that gave her sight lines on all 3 choke points before the assault element reached them. She noted the wind conditions and adjusted her expected engagement solutions mentally. Then she drew her equipment and started moving. Webb was in the assault element. He'd been in the assault element for every composite evaluation, and he was good there, genuinely good. His physical tools deployed in the environment where they were most effective, moving through terrain with a controlled aggression that the weeks of training had refined from raw material into something more precise. He drew his equipment and listened to Castellano, who was serving as assault element lead, give a brief movement order. "We follow the Overwatch timeline," Castellano said. "Elena is clearing our path. We stay on schedule. We arrive intact. We get ahead of the schedule. We're in the choke points before they are clear." Questions? No questions. 16 people who had spent weeks becoming people who understood the value of timing. Torres moved up beside Webb as they prepared to step off. He said nothing. He had the particular quality of silence that people carry into serious things. The pre-mission quiet that is not nervousness but focus, the settling of all attention onto the immediate and necessary. Webb pulled his kit tight, checked his radio, looked up at the sky where the storm was building in earnest, low clouds moving fast, the horizon somewhere northeast beginning to show the first indeterminate gray that was an hour from becoming dawn, and he thought about the transmission log. 9 positions in the dark. 112 minutes. And ahead of them somewhere in the hills, already moving, already calculating, Elena Vasquez was going to work the variable. The movement began. The 6 kilometers took 41 minutes of the pace the scenario demanded, and there were 41 minutes of the kind of physical effort that BUDOS had prepared them for but not made comfortable, because there is no comfortable version of 6 kilometers in storm conditions with full kit over mixed terrain in the dark. The wind was working against them consistently, pushing into their faces on the exposed ridgeline sections, and the rain had started, cold and horizontal, the kind of rain that finds every gap in your waterproofing. Elena had been moving faster and had left earlier. She was in her primary Overwatch position 14 minutes before the assault element reached the first choke point. She settled into the prone, weapon forward, scope up, and began her assessment. The first choke point was a narrow draw between 2 ridge sections, the natural funnel through which the assault element would have to pass. The vegetation on either side of it was dense enough to conceal a position and elevated enough to command the draw from above. If the opposing force had thought about this terrain the way she had thought about it, there would be something in that vegetation. There was. She picked up the signature at 1100 meters. Movement discipline was good but not perfect. The scope was a Schmidt and Bender PMI 5 to 25 power, and at 25 power the movement in the vegetation resolved into a shape that was unmistakably a person in a prone position with a weapon. She made her radio call. Overwatch to assault. First choke point occupied. Single position, east side, 1100 meters. Do not enter the draw. A pause while she continued her scan. Second position, west side of draw, same line. Flanking pair. Hold at your current position. The assault element held. 200 meters south of the draw. Waiting. She worked the problem. Two positions. 1100 meters. Wind at 23 knots from the northwest, gusting. Elevation advantage minimal. Rain reducing visibility, but not eliminating it through the optics quality glass. She needed engagement solutions for both positions, and she needed them to be simultaneous, or close enough to simultaneous that the second position couldn't react before it was also engaged. Marking rounds. Both hits needed to be within a 3-second window. She built her solution for the east position first, because east was a longer calculation with the wind crossing at a more complex angle. Elevation, windage, slight uphill angle adjustment. She ran it twice in her head, and the answer was the same both times, which meant it was probably right. She moved to the west position. Shorter distance by 40 meters. Wind more favorable. Simpler geometry. She would take east first. Time of flight, approximately 1.6 seconds at this distance. Move immediately to west. West solution already built. Second shot within 2 seconds of first. Total engagement window, 3.6 seconds. She breathed. She found the place between heartbeats. She fired. The east position marking round impacted, and the figure there showed the hit indicator and went flat. She was already moving to the west position before the impact registered on anything except her scope picture, the rifle swinging left, the reticle settling, the breathing already in the right phase. Second shot. West position hit. Figure went flat. 2.8 seconds total. She keyed the radio. Choke point 1 clay. Both positions marked. Assault element. Advance. The assault element moved through the draw. Torres glanced at the two marked positions as he passed and made a small internal note of the geometry involved, the angles, the distances, the conditions. He had been around precision shooters before. He knew what was difficult and what was very difficult. This was very difficult. He filed the data and kept moving. The second choke point cleared faster. Single position, more exposed. She had the solution built before the assault element was within 500 meters of the obstacle. One shot, one hit. The window was open before they arrived at it. The third choke point was where the scenario complicated, as scenarios at this level always do. The third choke point was a saddle between two hills, open ground on both sides, and the opposing force had placed their most sophisticated simulated element here. 3 positions, not in obvious locations. In the kind of positions that a thinking person chose, positions that used terrain to break up their silhouettes and place them in shadow even when ambient light was improving with the approaching dawn. Positions that Elena, in any other context, might have walked past. She found all 3. It took her 9 minutes, which was 4 minutes longer than the first 2 choke points combined. She scanned systematically, the way her father had taught her, dividing the terrain into sectors and working each one completely before moving to the next, not rushing, not assuming because she'd found nothing in the first 3 minutes that there was nothing to find. The systematic patience was the product of 11 years of deployments and the preceding 18 years of a father writing notes in a composition logbook and teaching his daughter that the variable not yet found is the most dangerous variable. She found the third position last because it was the best one. The operator, or the instructor playing the operator, had chosen a location that used a boulder shadow and a fold in the ground and the specific angle of the slope to create a position that was functionally invisible from any conventional approach. She found it because she noticed something she wasn't supposed to notice, a water droplet catching light on what should have been a completely dry surface, a 4-inch piece of equipment that had been exposed by the rain. 4 inches, 1100 meters. 1 droplet of water catching 5 seconds of diffuse pre-dawn light. She almost missed it. If she had been running on less sleep, less focus, anything less than her current capacity, she would have missed it. She didn't miss it. Third choke point, she radioed. 3 positions. East, northwest of the largest boulder. Tight height. You won't see it until you're in it. Center, prone behind the second brush line. Well concealed. West, fold in the ground. Approximately 15 meters inside the tree line. 3 position engagement required. Standby. In the assault element, Castellano heard the transmission and held up his fist. The element stopped, and Webb, standing in the stop formation with rain on his face and wind working at his kit, thought about what it meant to stand here at the edge of a choke point and know that between him and the objective someone had built 3 positions that he wouldn't have seen, and that the reason they were known was 1,100 meters of patience and a 4-inch piece of equipment catching light for 5 seconds in the pre-dawn dark. He thought about physics. He thought about bodies. He thought about what he'd said. He stood in the rain and waited. Elena built 3 engagement solutions simultaneously in her head, which is something very few people can do with the precision required for marking rounds at this distance in these conditions. She prioritized by reaction potential, which position could most quickly respond to being engaged and alert the others. She identified the center position as the highest reaction risk. She would go center, east, west, in a window she estimated at under 5 seconds. She breathed. The place between heartbeats. First shot. Second shot. A pause of exactly the space her calculation required. Third shot. 4.3 seconds. All 3 positions marked. Third choke point Clay. Advance. Bryce, monitoring from a position above the saddle with a night optic, watched the assault element move through the choke point. He watched the timing. He had the transmission log running. He looked at the 3 marked positions and the geometry between them and the location of the overwatch position, and he did the math in his head that the math required. He made a note. The note was not in the margin this time. The note said, "This is the answer command asked for." The assault element reached the objective at 0441 hours. The relay station scenario resolution took 11 minutes. 2 recruits performed particularly well in the close quarters clearing. Webb was one of them. The objective was secured in the notional operational sense at 0452 hours. Total elapsed time from initiation, 8 to 7 minutes. 3 minutes inside the 90-minute window. The margin of success was the choke points. The choke points had been cleared without the assault element taking a single simulated casualty. If any of the choke points had been handled differently, if the assault element had entered the draw without warning, if the third choke point's 3 positions had not been identified and engaged before the team moved through, the timeline would have broken. The objective would not have been reachable in the window. The margin of success had been Elena Vasquez and 1,100 meters of storm-condition precision shooting and 9 minutes of patient systematic observation that found a 4-inch piece of equipment in pre-dawn darkness. The debrief happened at 0600, back at the base, in the conference room with bad lighting and now very good coffee, because someone had understood that the 16 remaining recruits had been awake and active for 22 hours and the coffee was the minimum courtesy. Bryce ran it. He was precise and systematic, as always. When he reached the Overwatch analysis, he did something he had not done in 4 years of running this evaluation. He put down his clipboard and he looked at the assembled recruits and he said, "I'm going to describe what happened at the third choke point, because I want everyone in this room to understand what they benefited from." He described it. The 3 positions. The high quality of each. The specific challenge of the simultaneous 3-position engagement at 1,100+ meters in 23-knot crosswind, with intermittent rain reducing optical clarity. The 4-second window. The 4-inch indicator at 1,100 meters in 5 seconds of pre-dawn light. The room was very quiet. In 12 years of running this evaluation, I have had 17 exceptional Overwatch performances. I am now able to tell you that the performance last night was the best of the 17. That assessment is documented, it is objective, and it will be part of the formal record. He picked up his clipboard. That's the evaluation. Dismissed for a 6-hour rest cycle. 1400, final administrative reviews. The recruits filed out. The coffee got taken. The room went back to being a room with bad lighting and the accumulated weight of serious things that had happened inside it. In the corridor, Webb found Elena walking toward the barracks, and he fell into step beside her without preamble, because by this point there were no more preambles between them. The kind of thing that weeks of shared hard effort does to the social formalities between people. He didn't say anything for 100 meters. Neither did she. They walked in the post-evolution quiet that soldiers develop for the time between the doing and the processing, the internal space between the performance and the understanding of the performance. Then he said, "I watched you at the third choke point. I was in the formation looking at the ground you'd already cleared." She said nothing. "I was thinking about what you could see that we couldn't," he said. "What it looks like from 1100 meters. What the geometry is." "It's just distance and variables," she said. "It's not just that." She glanced at him sideways. The almost smile fully resolved into something more honest. "No," she said. "It's not just that." "What is it?" She walked for a few steps considering the question, the way she considered all questions, not rushing to the first available answer. Then she said, "My father used to say that the discipline is what you do when you're not shooting. All the hours of preparation and observation and positioning. The shooting is 10 seconds. The other 23 hours and 50 minutes is the job." Webb absorbed this. He thought about the 90-minute window they'd been given. About 8 to 7 minutes of it being accounted for. About where the 3 minutes came from. "He sounds like someone worth listening to," Webb said. He was. A pause. The past tense landed quietly, and Webb didn't ask, because there are questions that don't require asking when the person has given you what they intend to give. "I'm going to carry that," he said. "The 23 hours and 50 minutes. That's the right thing to carry," she said. They reached the barracks entrance, and she stopped and turned to face him with a direct assessment she brought to serious things, and she said, "You're going to be good at this." He understood that it was not a casual compliment. It was an evaluation. The same kind of evaluation she applied to choke points and height quality and 4-inch indicators at 1100 meters. He took it as such. "Thank you," he said. She went inside. He stood at the door for a moment in the cold and the fading storm and the day that was fully arrived now, gray and direct and making no promises, and he thought about the person he had been 3 weeks ago and the distance between that person and this moment. The distance was not comfortable to measure, but it was the right kind of uncomfortable, the kind that means something real has moved. He went inside. The 6-hour rest cycle was the best sleep he had gotten in 3 weeks. The 1400 administrative review was where the formal evaluations were delivered. Bryce and Reeves in the room with the 16 remaining recruits, and the documents distributed, and the numbers that represented 3 weeks of assessment presented to the people they assessed. Elena's document was 2 pages. The second page had a section at the bottom that bore Naval Special Warfare Command letterhead and a brief notation that she recognized as the language of formal recommendation for integration pathway advancement. It was the language command used when the answer to a question was yes. She read it twice. She folded it. She put it in her cargo pocket beside her logbook. She thought about her father's notebooks, those dense composition books filled with cramped handwriting, every shot documented, every condition recorded, every variable noted. She thought about the first entry in her own logbook, 840 meters, Nangarhar Province, 2014. The road that stayed clear, the convoy that passed through. She thought about 307 entries, each one a decision made from a prepared position and a prepared mind, each one a product of the 23 hours and 50 minutes that preceded the 10 seconds. She thought about a young woman in New Mexico at a shooting range, 16 years old, in a competition she had no business winning on the basis of her age and size, finishing 4th nationally against competitors who had been doing this since before she could read, and a quiet man in the scorer's tent who said nothing about the performance but made a note in his logbook and smiled privately in the direction of a specific kind of future he could see that others couldn't. She thought about what it means to be the answer to a question. Webb, across the room, received his evaluation and read it with the focused attention of someone reading a map. His scores were strong across most categories, exceptional in several, developing in the ones that required the kind of patience that gets built over years rather than weeks. The evaluators had noted his growth trajectory. They had noted the shift in his approach to team dynamics in the final 2 weeks. The shift was documented, measured, assessed as genuine and meaningful rather than performative. He read the words developing in the patient's categories and thought about 23 hours and 50 minutes. He thought about the logbook in Elena's cargo pocket. He thought about the kind of time that takes and made himself a private commitment about the investment it required. Torres read his evaluation with the economy of someone who has been evaluated many times and knows which numbers matter, and which ones are administrative housekeeping. The numbers that mattered were good. He folded his evaluation and put it in his pocket and looked around the room at the 15 other people who had made it to this point and felt the particular satisfaction of someone who has ended up in the right place. Kamika read his evaluation and grinned with the specific cheerfulness of a person from Maui who had decided that nothing was going to break him and had proven himself right. He looked across the room at Elena and gave her a small nod that acknowledged things that didn't need words. She returned it. Reeves closed the formal session at 14:37 and said the thing that he said at the end of every evaluation cycle, which was not a speech or a ceremony but a statement of simple fact. You're still hey. That means something. Now figure out what it means to you specifically, because the answer is different for everyone in this room, and the mission depends on all of you knowing your own answer. He left. Bryce left. The 16 recruits sat for a moment in the room with the bad lighting and the good coffee and the evaluated documents in their hands, and the particular quality of silence that exists in spaces where serious things have been done and absorbed and the next serious thing is somewhere ahead but not yet arrived. Then someone, it was Kamika, said something about food, and the spell broke into the practical, and 16 people who had been through something together began moving toward the next thing. Elena stood last. She stood in the empty room after the others had filed out and looked at the window where the Pacific was visible in the middle distance, gray-blue and running with the remains of the storm, still moving, still making its ancient indifferent promises and threats. She put her hand on the logbook in her cargo pocket and felt its weight, the specific weight of documented work, and she thought about her father. She thought about the day he died, 2 years ago, in the Magdalena house with the thin walls and the long winters, and about the last conversation they'd had, which was not dramatic because Hector Vasquez had not been a dramatic man. He had been lying in a hospital bed with equipment around him and the particular exhaustion of a man who has used everything he had and is satisfied with the use, and he had looked at her with clear eyes and said, "You have the logbook." It was not a question. "Yes," she'd said. "Then you have everything that matters," he'd said. "The rest is just doing the work." She stood in the room and thought about the work, about the doing of it, about what it meant to be here, at this particular intersection of her own history and the institution's evolving understanding of what was possible. She was not a symbol. She refused to be a symbol, because symbols don't breathe and don't bleed and don't lie in hides for 48 hours and symbols don't miss their fathers. She was a person who was very good at a specific set of skills, who had developed those skills over 31 years with complete dedication, and who had proven in 3 weeks of evaluation that the skills were real and deployable and reliable under conditions that tested everything. She was the answer to Command's question. The answer was yes. The pathway was viable. The integration was possible. The data was documented, assessed, verified by 2 experienced evaluators and would reach desks in Coronado and Virginia Beach and Tampa and change the shape of institutional thinking about a question that had been debated for years in conference rooms by people who hadn't had the data they now had. She had provided the data. She turned from the window and walked out of the room into the corridor and the cold air and the particular smell of the base that she had come to know in 3 weeks. Salt and concrete and the faint ghost of coffee that never quite left these hallways, and she thought about the next thing. The next thing was a deployment cycle. She knew it was coming. Command had communicated the general timeline through channels. A new theater, new terrain variables, new choke points to identify, new hides to build, new 23-hour and 50-minute preparations for 10-second decisions, new entries in the logbook. She walked toward the outside, and the wind hit her face with the same quality it had always had, cold and salt-heavy and completely indifferent to anything she felt or thought or intended. The Pacific ran south to north in the far view, ancient and inexhaustible, and the Coronado sky was doing the thing November skies do over the Pacific, layering itself in grays of different weights, not threatening, not welcoming, just being the sky that it was. She walked into it. Behind her, in the corridor, Webb came out of the evaluation room and watched her walk toward the outside, and he thought about something Reeves had said on the first morning. There is one person standing in this formation today who already knows who she is. He thought about the specificity of that. Knowing who you are. Not the performance of knowing, not the claim of knowing, but the actual internal fact of it. The settled thing. The thing that doesn't require external validation because it was built from the inside on a foundation that nothing has been able to move. He thought about who he was. He thought about the distance between the person who had made a comment about physics 3 weeks ago and the person standing in this corridor now. And he thought about Torres saying it was the kind of thing a person needed to figure out at the right speed. He was figuring it out. He walked outside. Torres came out next, and Carmichael, and Castellano, and the others, and they stood in the cold November air at Naval Amphibious Base Coronado, and the storm was moving away to the southeast, dragging its weather behind it. And the sky to the west over the Pacific was doing the first thing it does when a storm leaves, which is to reveal the quality of light that was there all along behind the clouds, lower than summer but real, clean, the specific California winter light that has a precision to it, that the summer never quite achieves. Elena stood at the edge of the training ground looking west and felt the light on her face and heard the sound of the others coming out behind her, and she did not turn around immediately. She stood in the light for the amount of time she needed to stand in it, which was not long, because she was efficient with everything including this. Then she turned and faced the group. 16 people. 16 people who had been through something together that had cost each of them something significant and had given each of them something they hadn't arrived with. She looked at them with a direct, calibrated attention she brought to serious assessments. Carmichael was grinning, because of course he was. Torres was doing his particular thing of looking like someone who has put all the information in the right files. Webb was looking at her with the specific quality of attention that someone brings to a person they have recently and substantially reconsidered. And then it was something that wasn't quite apology, because the apology had already been made and received, but was its continuation in the form of a sustained and honest awareness. She thought about what to say. She thought about the logbook in her pocket and her father's logbooks on the shelf in the Magdalena house, currently in boxes in storage because she didn't have a permanent station address that could receive them yet. She thought about 23 hours and 50 minutes. She said, "Good work." 2 words. The flattest available form of the highest available assessment. The same thing Rodriguez had said to her in the water, on target, and it meant the same thing now that it had meant then, which was everything that needed to be said. Carmichael's grin widened. Torres gave her a small nod. Castellano, who was not a sentimental person by any available measure, looked at the ground for a moment in the way that people look at the ground when something has landed correctly. Webb said nothing. He stood in the winter light and let the 2 words be what they were. He thought about the long process of becoming someone worthy of those words from that particular source, and understood that the process was not complete. It was not close to complete. He was at the beginning of the becoming, which was the only honest place to be. The becoming was the work. The work was ongoing. Senior Chief Reeves had come out behind them and was standing at the edge of the group with his coffee and his 22 years and his calibrator that had spent 6 years at BUD-OS assessing who would and who wouldn't, and he was watching Elena Vasquez stand in the winter light with the expression of someone who has just seen something they wanted to see. Not surprise. Confirmation. He thought about the command document in his briefcase, the recommendation, the institutional language that would travel from Coronado to Virginia Beach, and the desks where the shape of the future got decided. He thought about what the data would say when it arrived and about the conversation that would follow and about the specific practical consequence of that conversation, which was that the pathway would open. Not just for Elena, who had already walked so far along it that the opening was almost beside the point. For the ones who came after her. For the next person who showed up at BUD-OS with a service record that made an experienced evaluator sit down and read it twice, and the person after that, and the person after that. He thought about the 16 people standing in his training ground in the November light and about what had been built between them in 3 weeks that wouldn't have been built without all 16 of them specifically, without the collision of assumptions and evidence, without the boat crew evolution and the transmission log, and the administrative conversation and the maintenance room and the 3rd choke point with 3 positions in the dock. He thought about a 4-inch piece of equipment at 1,100 meters catching 5 seconds of pre-dawn light. He thought about what it takes to find that. What has to be built inside a person for that to be possible? The years. The logbooks. The father with the cramped handwriting. The New Mexico range in the wind. The first shot at 7 years old landing in the center on the third try and the father behind her, not touching, just watching, making a note. He put his coffee down and walked back inside because there was administrative work to finish and the day was not done. Elena watched him go. She filed the observation of his expression in the same way she filed everything, efficiently and without excess analysis. She thought about the document in her cargo pocket. She thought about the next deployment cycle, which she was ready for. She thought about the logbook and the next entries it would hold, the variables that would need to be worked, the hides that would need to be built, the 23 hours and 50 minutes that preceded each 10 seconds of decision. She thought about her father's last words to her. Then you have everything that matters. The rest is just doing the work. She touched the logbook through the fabric of her cargo pocket. Then she looked at the Pacific, which was still doing what it always did, and she made the private agreement she always made before the next difficult thing began. The agreement was not with the difficulty. The agreement was with herself. It was old and simple, and she had been honoring it since she was 7 years old, prone behind a rifle on a high desert range with the wind coming down off the Chupadera Mesa. She would be ready. She would do the work. She would find the thing that needed finding. And whatever the variable was, she would work it. The light shifted. The storm was fully gone now. The Pacific ran south to north, gray-blue and eternal. And the 16 people who remained after 3 weeks of being stripped to their essentials stood in the November clarity of it and breathed the salt air and knew, each in their own way, that something had changed and that the changing was not finished. It was never finished. That was the point. That was the work. 2 weeks after the evaluation cycle closed, a package arrived at the base administrative office addressed to Lieutenant Commander Elena Vasquez. The return address was a storage facility in Socorro, New Mexico, 40 miles east of Magdalena. Elena picked it up on a Tuesday morning between a briefing and a kit inspection, carrying it under her arm back to the barracks without opening it, because she already knew what it was. She sat on the edge of a rack with the package in her lap for a moment. The barracks was quiet. Most of the others were in the briefing rotation, and the room had the particular stillness of spaces that are usually full of people and are temporarily not. The kind of stillness that allows thinking. She opened the package. 7 composition notebooks. Dense, weathered, the covers soft from years of handling. Her father's logbooks. The handwriting on the first page of the top notebook was exactly the cramped K-full script of a man who had understood that precision extended beyond the rifle, that documentation was a form of respect for the work. The first entry was dated 1987. Hector Vasquez, age 22, Fort Benning, Georgia. His first recorded shot as a qualified sniper instructor candidate. Distance, conditions, ammunition, result. Everything noted. Everything measured. She held the notebook for a long time without reading further. Then she opened her own logbook and placed it beside his and looked at the two of them together. His from 1987 and hers from 2014. And between the two of them was a continuous line of documented work that spanned nearly 4 decades and 2 generations and several wars and a specific, patient, unannounced inheritance of craft that she had been carrying for 31 years without fully understanding its weight until now. She understood it now. She closed both logbooks and sat with the understanding for the amount of time it required, which was not long because she was who she was, and then she put her father's notebooks carefully in her locker and her own notebook back in her cargo pocket, and she went to the kit inspection because the work was ongoing and the kit needed to be ready. That afternoon, Senior Chief Reeves found her at the armory going through her pre-deployment equipment check. The deployment orders had come through that morning. 2 weeks out. She already knew the general theater and the specific role and the kind of terrain she'd be working in, and she had begun the preparation cycle that her father had taught her, the 23 hours and 50 minutes that preceded everything real. Reeves stood in the armory doorway and watched her work for a moment before speaking, the way he watched everything at BUDOS, with a particular assessment of someone who is always taking inventory. Package came, he said. Yes, Senior Chief. His logbooks. She paused in her equipment check and looked at him with the recognition that he had known about the logbooks, which meant he had known about her father in the specific way that commanding officers who care about their people know things, not through surveillance but through the kind of attention that notices what matters to someone. Yes, she said. He came into the armory and leaned against the opposite workbench and crossed his arms, and the quality of the moment shifted from professional to something adjacent to it, something that the military allows in very specific circumstances and rarely. He would have liked to see the third choke point, Reeves said. She looked at him steadily. Something moved behind her eyes that she did not suppress, because some things are not suppressed and shouldn't be. He would have found the fourth position, she said, if there had been one. Reeves made a sound that was almost a laugh but came from somewhere deeper. Probably. A pause. The armory smelled like gun oil and metal and the particular dust of equipment that spends its life being prepared and repaired. Outside, the Pacific was visible through a high window, running its eternal south to north course. The command recommendation went up this morning, Reeves said. Full integration pathway. They are calling it a pilot framework with your deployment cycle as the operational validation phase. She nodded. She had expected this, because she had read the document carefully and understood its language. There's going to be scrutiny, he said. Not hey, up the chain. People who weren't in that evaluation room. People who have questions that the data answers but who aren't yet familiar with the data. You're going to be the data. I've been the data for 11 years, she said. Now it's official. She looked at her equipment and then back at him. It doesn't change what the work is, she said. No, Reeves agreed. It doesn't change what the work is. He straightened and moved toward the door, and then he stopped and turned back with the expression of someone who has one more thing that needs saying and has decided it will be said. Your father came to this base, he said. 1992, Instructor Exchange Program. I was a first-year petty officer. I watched him run a training evolution on a day very similar to this one. Cold, wet, that particular Pacific light. He was exceptional. The kind of exceptional that you recognize immediately and remember for the rest of your career. Elena was very still. I didn't know his daughter when you showed up here, Reeves said. I knew the file. I knew the record. It took about 4 days before I knew you were his. She said nothing. The still quality of her was not absence. It was the full presence of someone receiving something important. He would have been standing where I'm standing, Reeves said. And he would have said the same thing I'm about to say, because it was his philosophy first and I borrowed it 30 years ago and used it ever since. He paused. The discipline is everything you do when you're not shooting. He left. Elena stood in the armory with the gun oil smell and the high window light and the echo of words she had heard first from her father's voice at 14 years old on a New Mexico range, and which had just come back to her from a direction she had not anticipated, traveled 30 years through another person's memory to find her here in exactly the moment she needed to receive them. She did not cry. She was not built for crying in armories. But she stood with her hand flat on the workbench and she breathed with the controlled precision of someone managing something real, and she gave the moment exactly the weight it deserved, which was considerable. Then she went back to her equipment check. The kit needed to be ready. The work was ongoing. Webb found Torres in the common area that evening and sat down beside him with 2 cups of coffee and the particular look of someone who has been thinking for several hours and has arrived somewhere. I want to extend my logbook practice, he said. Torres looked at him, documenting every evolution. Conditions, approach, result. Everything measured. Torres was quiet for a moment. Then he said, that's the right instinct. She's been doing it since 2014, Webb said. Her father did it since 1987. Torres accepted his coffee. He looked at it for a moment, and then he said, the best people I've known in this work all had something like that. Some form of keeping account. Some practice of taking the work seriously enough to document it. He paused. The ones who didn't, mostly didn't last. Webb thought about lasting, about what it meant in this specific context. Not just surviving the physical demands, but remaining excellent across years, across deployments, across the accumulation of hard experiences that either build a person or erode them depending on what the person does with the material. I was wrong about her, Webb said. Not as confession, a statement of documented fact. Most people are, initially, Torres said. The ones who change are the ones worth keeping. Outside the window, the November dark was complete, and the Pacific was invisible but audible, the surf running its slow percussion against the Coronado shore. The sound that underscored everything that happened at this base, the sound that had underscored Elena's 3 weeks here, and would underscore the deployment that was 2 weeks away, and the deployments after that, and the ongoing patient accumulation of work that would eventually fill another 7 logbooks and sit in someone's cargo pocket as irreplaceable inheritance. The sound of the Pacific, indifferent and eternal, making no promises and threatening everything. And somewhere in it, if you listen with the right kind of attention, the sound of all the work that had been done and all the work that remained. Elena, in her rack with her father's first logbook open on her chest, read the 1987 entry one more time. His cramped, careful handwriting. The distance. The conditions. The result. She made a note in her own logbook about the day's equipment check. Conditions, observations, preparation status, variables to monitor. She closed both books. She was ready.